way as the previous section, I will have 3 questions I will ask to give your reflections and insights from your perspectives. But at the same time, if there is an important aspect that has not been covered by question, of course, feel free to bring it into the discussion. And I will think that I will borrow Katarzyna's model. So we will start, yeah? And the first question I would like to ask, to what extent should the protection and preservation of national minorities be understood not only as a matter of rights and legislation, but also as a matter of cultural memory, symbolic recognition, and control over how their own stories are told? Who decides what counts as authentic representation? The institutions, media platforms, museums, digital archives, the minority communities themselves, or some negotiated partnership between them?
Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to join you today. The question is a very thought-provoking one, I think deliberately broad, but like previous speakers, I would like to also state in advance my positionality when answering the question. So I think that in this contribution, I would like to share my thoughts as someone who works on how minorities develop their identities online. So not heritage stricto sensu, but cultural expression. And with that in mind, I would also like to suggest that we expand a little bit our discussion and not only cover preservation, but also development, because it makes sense. It's a much more dynamic process. The research that we have undertaken suggests so. So I will tell you a little bit how that kind of research shows the role of minority identity formation online. And I will engage with 2 out of the 3 key terms that you asked us to reflect on, namely authority and representation. So for authority, my thinking has been developed around 3 key points, namely who, how, and what are the current challenges. So who is, authoritative enough to provide an authentic representation? And with the digital landscape, I think we need to be a little bit more careful and a little bit more, cautious in the sense that the way the web works, you have users engaged. Among the minority members, you have also, however, intermediaries play a role in controlling how identities are expressed online. So in this context, it's important to remember that we don't look at the state-group interaction, but the state private entity and minority group interaction. In that sense, the other implication is that you don't only have public control of what is being said, public regulation, I think you also have private regulation. So a little bit more complex of a scenario. Now, the how. It looks like big tech is setting the standards of what is tolerable online, and that has an impact, if you wish, on minority and national minority identity formation. At the same time, like you've highlighted in your introduction, there has been so far disproportional focus on the legal aspects when it comes to regulating online content. And here in brackets, when we look at it from the minority perspective, think of hate speech. I think it helps a lot, imagine the possible scenarios. This aspect, this take on government regulation is characterized by legal constructions, disproportionate legal constructions of victimhood, fixation, and narratives of criminality. So I think that if we want to explore minority identity, we need to move beyond that. The second point that we need to also remember when we look at online content is content moderation, and that's another big field of relevance to minority protection. So far, we have predominant approaches that address the harm that minorities are subjected to online, but without real transparency, so we don't know the mechanisms. What we do know is that there are certain specific tools like filtering, identification upgrades, but all in all, it depends on the individual user. There is no group consideration of the identity or the impact at a group level. Now, let me move on to briefly the current challenges from the authority perspective of the question. The way research has developed, we already know that it is not sustainable to maintain a model of online control or regulation of content which is based on neutrality. Online spaces are not neutral as far as minorities are concerned. So it doesn't make much sense for a sustainable governance model to maintain, for example, criminal law as the main aspect. We need to also complement that with other, if you want, dimensions. And then how do we deal with material that you find that if you want, harms minorities, but which is not legally, if you want, punishable. So the awful but lawful content. So that is a big problem, and this also prompts, the whole discussion. And then the other thing, when we speak about challenges connected to authority, is the notion of discrimination. We need a broader spectrum of what it means to be discriminated as a minority online, in a way that we don't end up with a constellation where equality becomes antithetical to difference. So if we want to create, a fertile environment for development of minority identities, that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges. Let me briefly move to the concept of representation. When we look scientifically at minority identity development online, we have to remember that it's not only a product for big tech to regulate or states to enforce legal frameworks on, but it's also a production. So we're looking at processes of negotiation and debate and hybridity, much more complexity that we would like to think of. So in that sense, and speaking to the best practices dimension, it is, I think, useful to see development of cultural expressions of minorities online as both a space of potential threat, I've already alluded to that, but also an online space as personal agency and group agency. Develop who you are and who you want to be seen as. So nevertheless, digital media, the way they exist today, they mostly reflect social inequalities. Two examples for you to remember, and I can tell more if anyone is interested. Data violence, so how the data of minority groups are being used by platforms and ultimately by states, especially authoritarian ones, against them. And algorithmic violence, so the way AI tools work against, again, minorities, contributing to this stereotypization debate we were having earlier on. However, the reality is that minority cultural representations have complexities with which platforms do not acknowledge and don't have the necessary tools. And in fact, they should be treated in a way we discussed in earlier panels, in connection and not distinct from their historical and cultural interpretation, including from the majority perspective, because that is important. Final point for now, minorities make deliberate choices online. They can be, for example, a member of a national minority group, a woman, and a disabled person, all at the same time. And express as such themselves online. What I'm trying to get to is that in terms of authority and representation, we need a firmer link between digital inclusion and social cohesion. And I think this is where a lot of more work will be required, not only from a scientific perspective, but also from, a governance perspective. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Agata?
First of all, thank you very much for invitation to Alexandra personally. I am very happy to be here, not only as a researcher, but also as a mother who will be in any given situation a mother of a child who will be representative of national minority. So I have a lot of things to do, especially after the panel about the teaching languages. Thank you very much for this very complex question. I will be try to answer them, and please bear in mind that I will be speaking from the perspective of memory researchers specializing in Central Europe. In this rather narrow geographical definition, I will speak mostly about Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and also a little bit of Poland. And I have to say that this question is a rather tricky one, because even a cursory glance at the history of the museum's institution reveals the direct dependence of the museum on the developments of the national communities and states. And we can see this especially in the 19th century museum that have served as an institution that supported the creation of a unified vision of national identity. And we can name a lot of examples, and the most obvious one is the National Museum in Prague and its role of the Czech national movement. So very often to these days, museums have privileged the experience of majority while marginalizing the minority voices. It is happening because, especially in Central Europe, in those countries that I am speaking of, museums are directly linked to the power and by memory politics and to the politics in a large perspective. And once again, the best example of this is, in my opinion, what was happening in Hungary in the last 16 or even more years, when Viktor Orban was in power. And in 2024, I analyzed how the different minorities are represented in Hungary, in Hungarian Historical Museum, and focusing on the impact of Viktor Orban government. And despite of the significant contribution of minorities such Germans, Slovaks, and Roma to the history and culture of Hungary, their presence in museum spaces was very limited. Of course, we can find example, and in my last little speech here, I will name some of example, but this is some general conclusion from my studies. But we can observe some exception. And for example, we can see that the Slovak minority, the Slovak impact on the Hungarian culture and history was more presented in the Hungarian Museum. But we can say why. This is a third minority if we count. So why the third one, not the first, not the second? And if we can I analyze the documents, I analyze the political agenda, and we can find, I came to conclusion that actually it was a direct effect on special agreement between Hungary and Slovakia, and even more deeper, it was a special agreement because between the Viktor Orban and Robert Fico when he was in power. So we can find some similarities in their political agenda. So to answer your question directly, I would say that for sure the legal rights are essential, but they are not sufficient. And recognition is not only being protected by the state, by the laws, but as the museum example can show, it is the most productive model. It's a negotiated partnership, and I will elaborate this idea later on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I will draw most of my examples of best practice from Wales, which is the case that I know the best. I will start also with the idea of the positionality. So I put myself as a migrant to the United Kingdom. I'm a new speaker of Welsh, which means I learned to speak Welsh as an adult. And I'm a member of the Plurling Media here with Jenny. That is a network that studies, the use of different minority languages within the media setting. So most of the examples are also going to be from media. Regarding a best practice that I think very positive on representation, as was mentioned, is the case of S4C, Channel Pedwar Cymru, the Welsh language channel in Wales, particularly because they took a perspective of portraying the whole of Wales. So it was not only that they were going to portray Welsh language, but also how Welsh is used all over the country. And that implied that they had to admit that there was going to be a diversity of registers, a diversity of pronunciation, and even including the occasional word in English filtering through. So that was important because that would show the reality of how people use the language. And that has been core to what S4C has done. From the perspective of the Welsh government, they've done some support for digital tools, which is relevant to bring up a set of tools called Cysgliad, which I personally use when I took my exam in Welsh, that allows you to check grammar elements as you type. And they did this together with Microsoft. They also did a lot of work on corpus collection, and this is quite relevant because they're developing a UK-wide LLM that addresses minority languages of the United Kingdom, including Cornish, Welsh, Scottish Gaelic, Irish, and Scots. So that is very relevant because nowadays we all use artificial intelligence, and as was mentioned before as well, we need to have some control of how the artificial intelligence that we use creates its data set. Now, from the other perspective, there's a very interesting project called News for All that was developed first in Cardiff and then in Blaenau Ffestiniog that has addressed why do certain people feel that they're removed from news. It's not that they don't think that they're important, but this was a collaboration done by a researcher that is interested in community journalism and the BBC, trying to understand why do some audiences not watch and not engage with the BBC at all. And it was interesting because it was done in a majorly migrant community in Cardiff, and then with a group that is majorly a Welsh language speaking community in Blaenau Ffestiniog. So showing that these two that are usually separate, migrant communities and a national minority language, they were brought together. And that, I guess, connects a bit with how it was discussed earlier about how education should be or how grassroots movements should be incorporated. And those, I think, are what I would highlight for now as in terms of that space, let's say, in which representation and authority take place.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting conference. I also want to extend a thank you to our translators. They are doing an amazing job. So thank you, and I apologize that I usually speak quite rapidly, so I will try to keep the pace down to help you do your job. So I come from Finland, from the Swedish-speaking I will call it a minority group because it is, in numerical terms, a minority, but in legal terms, it is not. So Swedish is a national language in Finland next to Finnish, but Swedish is spoken by about 5% of the population, so in numerical terms, a minority. I am a journalist, or I used to work as a journalist. Now I teach journalism at the University of Helsinki, and I also research media, well, minority language media for minority languages, and language attitudes. So I have 2 research projects going on, and I will refer to these in the different answers today. Regarding the question, which I think was very, very good, I would say that if we are talking about the protection and preservation of a minority group, legal documents and legal instruments are truly crucial. But if we are talking about normalizing a minority in a society, empowering it, making them equal to all other groups, then we need other forms. And that's where, for example, media comes into play. And I think of course, I mean, the legal setting is the foundation, but when we have that in place at least on some level, as well as education, then we really need to talk about the public debate. And as we heard in the previous session, Jolanta talked about how minorities are portrayed in majority media. And that is a very, very important aspect if we want to accept or talk about how to get the majority to accept and include minority groups. Because if the discursive debate about minorities is mainly negative, they will never be included. And especially if you always look at the minority from the outside, there is the majority always looking at the minority in majority media, then it's always the other group, someone else. So I think this is one important aspect to bear in mind. Then when we talk about the representation of the minority within the minority community, then we also need a media sphere for the minority. And that's where we enter the area of minority language media. So what is minority language media and what is minority language journalism? That is something that I have been really diving deep into in my research and find extremely interesting. Because, I mean, today you mentioned AI. You can translate anything to any language, basically. Not quite any language, but very easily to many languages. Is that enough? Is it enough that we have the same content in the language that you can understand? That does fulfill an important mission, but it's definitely not enough. If you have a language minority or any other minority, a national minority, an ethnic minority, an indigenous group, those perspectives that you think about things, you look at society in another way, you have a completely different perspective on your life, on society, on your community group. Those will not be reflected in an AI translation. Those will only be reflected within community-based media. And when I say community-based, I do not mean small media outlets, maybe online, provided by enthusiasts and activists. I'm talking about if we really want to embrace the minority groups in society, we need professional media in these minority languages, which is, of course, an issue of economy in many ways. And we see very different minorities in Europe and, of course, very many different solutions to this. In some cases, I come from a country where, well, people call it heaven. It's certainly not heaven. But we do have a lot of media provision in Swedish in Finland. We have the public service broadcasting company providing 2 radio channels as well as television content, a lot of online content in Swedish. But we also have, well, on the mainland, we have 7 newspapers in Swedish, which is quite a lot for a small group of people. In other contexts, this would never be possible. So we also need to keep in mind that the contexts are very different. But I think that if we really want to, even though the role of media has changed a lot, naturally, as we all know, still media fulfills an important function in this sense today. And who has power over the media is an interesting question. And is there a provision of professional journalists in the minority language? And is there an educational path for these journalists? So these are some of the questions we work with. And as Enrique said, the plurilingual media he referred to is a cost action, which is an EU-funded instrument for networking between practitioners and academics. So if anybody in the room works with media and language vitality, you are most welcome to join. You can Google plurilingual media and you'll find all the instructions.
Thank you very much for your insights and your contribution and for questions that raised during this first answer round. I think that we will come back to them. And let us now try to move from the question of representation to the question of transmission across generation. Because all of you represent connected but somehow different domains, and all from one side claiming to facilitate the transmission of minority identities across generations. And how do these different spheres actually contribute to that transmission? Where do you see the greatest gaps or contradictions in current European approaches? And critically, does the medium itself, broadcast media, physical exhibition, digitized archive, change what cultural transmission actually means?
This is an interesting question as well. You have very good questions. And I think in a way, we are thinking about this backwards if we think that there is one cultural identity that can be transmissioned through different generations, and that this cultural identity in a way would be the same for everyone. There are, of course, cultural dimensions, history, music, literature, art, traditions that might be connected to a certain minority, and these are, I would say, quite closely connected to the family and the community, and also schools. I think the school system is very important in this sense. But when we talk, if I stick to the media sector, I think we have a very tricky situation with today's media sphere if we want to transmit anything between cultures and generations, because people of different generations use media in very different ways. So when talking about legacy media, television, radio, newspapers, we have a certain age group taking part of those, and younger people usually are mostly online and in social media. So do these meet at all? What is transmitted between the different generations in the media sphere? It's a very important question, regardless of minority majority. So the media divide makes this very, very tricky. And especially, I think in the first or second session, somebody mentioned the view of minorities being kind of folklorish, old-fashioned. And of course, might be very important for some groups. But if you want to have young people engaging in the minority, well, different interests, but it might not be the best way to try to get people engaged. So I think what we need to think about if we want to enhance the transmission of the language of the minority culture, we need to think about quality as well as the multitude of platforms. So if we do something good, really good, it will spread beyond the little community. And if we do it on multiple platforms, we might reach the young people as well. This is, of course, not easy, but I think it's important to not live kind of in the idea that if it's a minority media output, that it's somehow less worth or not as good as majority media. So I think this should be at least a goal. Another thing that I think is important here is to remember that one of you mentioned it as well, that identities we don't have one identity, we have many identities. So that means that you can connect to different groups, different people, depending on context, and also that within the language group or minority group, we don't have this one identity. We have many different identities and views and political views, just as many as we have in the majority groups. So we shouldn't treat minority groups as a homogeneous group, because they are not. And in one of the research projects that I lead at the moment, we study young Swedish-speaking people's language ideologies and attitudes. And one thing that we see quite clearly is a very strong sense of shame, language shame. they feel shame over not knowing the majority language, Finnish. They are in different situations where they should know the language better than they do, and they feel ashamed that they don't. In educational settings, they might feel ashamed because I don't know. If I don't know the majority language and my classmate does, I feel ashamed in relation to him or her. But also, interestingly enough, with the bilingual students, they might also feel ashamed that they don't know either language well enough, which they often hear because you just mix the languages, for example, or that if they are strongly situated in a minority setting, they might feel ashamed that they know the majority language. So this is a super complex matter. And then especially when talking about young people, we then have the international setting. They might care more about, English and what's happening in the world than what's happening in the really small context. So maybe more questions than answers, but I will stop here and we can continue.
Thank you very much, and we move on.
I will pick up from what Jenny mentioned, and it's there's a big change in what media are, and that is probably the main thing. And we all live through media, and that's the thing that we have to acknowledge, that it's part of our everyday life and it's not something separate. So just think about the most basic of things. When you message your friends through your phone and you send videos, you send stickers, you type. When you type, I don't know if this is the case for you, but when I use WhatsApp, there's 4 languages in my WhatsApp at the moment, and sometimes I have to switch actively between them, because if not, I don't get the right characters, or the words might be changed in a way that is very annoying. Now, that whole process of doing it is also very annoying, and sometimes you don't do it, and you get very interesting messages that you send your friends in different transformations of the words. One of the main challenges, I think, is that we still have this old school view of what media is based on broadcasting. That is problematic because policy and regulation is based on broadcasting, but broadcasting is only a bit of what happens through media nowadays. And I will give you an example that recently I was at a meeting with the Commissioner for Welsh in Wales and Ofcom, so the regulator for media, for broadcast media in Wales. And we were brought together to see how can we address, new issues in the media. Now, the first question for me was, how come there's no one from the platforms? How come there's no one who creates content? So younger people who use any platform to communicate, TikTok, YouTube, whatever. And there was no one from video games. And I was wondering, so this is the idea that the regulator for media has on what media is. And obviously at the end of that meeting, and I must tell you, it was a bit sad sometimes, because one of the main things was we should keep on supporting the license fee, which makes sense. It supports a part of media that is relevant, broadcast media. But what about the rest of media? They were not even represented. So this is how, from the top down, as Tomasz was pointing out earlier, from the top down, there's one view of media that is very different than the experience. So now, best practices. S4C, the Welsh language channel, has Hunch. And Hunch works as a different brand from S4C because of what Jenny mentioned. So older people watch S4C. Younger people would not watch S4C, but they might watch Hunch on YouTube. And this is important because one of the newest policies and the strategy of S4C, very well received, is that they're going to go digital first and provide content that goes directly to the platforms, because they said something that I find very important now, and is you don't want the audiences to have to look for your content. You have to get the content to your audiences. So if they're watching YouTube or they're watching TikTok, well, that is where we should bring the language. Because if they don't find it there, they're going to move away from the language.
I will follow the Jenny way of thinking because I find it very interesting. But unlike media, museums are institutions of long-term memory, and their contribution to cultural transmission lies not only in preserving heritage, but also in transforming certain interpretation of the past into a publicly recognized and legitimized narratives. And what makes museum particularly important is their authority. And when a minority community appears in museum exhibition, it is no longer presented solely as a certain community, but it becomes part of a broader public understanding on the past. At the same time, as I said before, museums, especially in Central Europe, face a significant challenge. Many of them were originally established, created to support national building project and reinforce national identities. And once again, we can observe this not only in Hungary, but also in Poland, for example. And now there is this way of thinking gain public also in the Czech Republic. But as a result, minority stories have often been presented rather as a supplementary and not constitutive element of a shared past, shared history. And this creates a contradiction that is still visible today, also in some cases of exhibition about Polish and Lithuanian past. And for this reason, I also believe that the most important question is not whatever museum transmits minority identities, but how they do so. Are minorities presented as a separate group existing alongside the main nation, or as some kind of really important actor who have actively contributed to the shaping of this shared history, shared past?
So I interpreted the second question in the following way. Transmission as opportunity for cultural expression from the standpoint of minorities, and the medium itself, in my understanding, is, online spaces more broadly. So the key question that I asked here when I read the question is, how do minorities attempt to influence the debate on their own cultural self-identification online? And to answer the first bit about the generational dimension, online spaces, as we know, scientifically have a clear generational dimension. And by that, I mean, we already know that according to the type of platform, you would find specific profiles of users from a generational perspective. So that is already, scientific knowledge. What is less explored, however, from the standpoint of minority groups, is how digital spaces are as concrete, if not more, a space than national political systems. And why does this matter? It matters because they can allow for non-formal political actors, which minority groups often are, to become a part of, the debate about who they are and what their claims are. So a way to connect internet with democratic participation. At the same time, digital spaces can accommodate a much broader range of social struggles, which means that they have offer the possibility to create new political subjects, again, very much in the radar of marginalized and excluded groups such as minorities. So the discussion becomes, I think, when we talk about transmission, also about what we call networked visibility. So strategic and situated articulation of a group's voice, which exposes the advantages, the pleasures, but also the risks of being seen online. So it's this very broad and almost bipolar reality for minorities online. So the points to consider when we look at transmission, I guess, are indirectly connected to what was already said. Are these new forms of digital media new cultural spaces, or simply reinterpretation of the older ones? And the second question, what should we make of the internet? Is it a dialogical type of communication that encourages exchange of culture between minorities and majorities, minorities and other minorities, or new, groups that are created as a result of being online? My response to that and my understanding of the literature and research when it comes to this particular question speaks of a dilemma between inclusiveness of participation, so the opportunity to be more engaged, but also the reality of platform governance and the rules that regulated that, which paint a picture of digital divide when it comes to minorities and new forms of inequality that, again, penalize minority groups, whether we talk about power, contestation, hierarchy, all of that shapes softwares, for example. And the example of language is one of many. Lastly, a last point for this question is that minorities, when they exist online at the moment, are confronted with a paradox. They are both at the same time invisible to state and dominant institution, but hyper visible when it comes to being racialized, sexualized, and more of those ized characteristics within media portrayals. So you see, it's a little bit, paradoxical. So the solution to that is platform activism, or part of the solution to that is platform activism, which pushes back against identities being commodified. So transmission has a component which is, the struggle against commodification. But at the same time, of course, we should be aware and sensitive to the fact that their content, the content that belongs to minorities, tends to be challenged very often by systemic inequalities, which, reproduce themselves online like they exist offline. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have talked also that, and we have agreed, I guess, that we have different and not one identity. But the last question will maybe pay special attention to this cultural identity. And I would like to ask, in contemporary Europe, how can minority communities preserve their distinct cultural identities and languages while simultaneously participating in broader civic, national, and European frameworks? So I know that you have this long question, so I won't read just to have enough time to answer this. Please. Yeah. We will keep the same order.
Okay, cool. So as I said, yes, indeed, there are many paradoxes in looking at, cultural expressions from minority groups online, especially from the integration preservation, perspective. And as I said, the digital and the non-digital are almost hard to distinguish. So this is like, if you want a disclaimer. But I think the public relevance of online minority cultural politics is unlikely to diminish, because you see minorities are more and more putting forward claims for recognition and support the same way they would do in offline spaces. They are getting better at building alliances with the general public, and also using digital spaces as opportunities for intra-community communication. So these are the traditional, if you want, streams. At the same time, there is a social perspective for the group itself that we need to study and map more carefully, in connection in particular to digital democratic processes, but also the institutional perspective, which speaks to, the role of each actor. And this is a multi-stakeholder environment, so you don't just have the groups, as I said. So all in all, I would say that it is true that new digital technologies can improve the top-down information, but also the bottom-up mechanisms, to echo one of the themes that was put forward earlier. But of course, they do rely on sophisticated networked spaces where individual and collective agency of minority groups come together in a meaningful and strategized, if I may say, way. And just as an indication of a good practice, we recently did some work deliberately intersectional on Sami women content creators. And we looked a little bit at their presence online and what makes them, produce content and what kind of, connections they are making with their online cultural expressions. And it is clear that here we're looking at a constellation between identity, representation, like you asked, discourse, so what kind of narrative, and power. And in that study, we asked how intersectional digital representation of Nordic Sami women engages with global challenges. So we were adding on top the transnational, which is feasible and within reach if you're using, digital tools. The purposes of their use of online platforms, whether it was Instagram or or TikTok, was to enhance their connection offline, to build networks, to support protest movements, very acute environmental dimension here, challenge power relations, and a bit less to create new groups. So the first four were more prominent. They were using indigenous rights, international law, language, environmental issues as niche topics of engagement, and they were reproducing very interestingly techniques and tools that you would find in cultural transmission offline, like storytelling, oral iteration, consensus-oriented decision making, and they were even using visual symbols that would connect them, tightly with the communities in which they belong. So whether it was words, designs, colors, musical instruments, it was a very broad range. And sometimes very interestingly, we observed a shift in language, and that was a conscious choice. They were not speaking their own language, they were speaking English because of this, they were strategizing in a way to prioritize engagement with other indigenous groups. So in that sense, if we want to move forward from that kind of understanding of cultural transmission online, I would suggest that we, problematize further concepts like digital inclusion. So how the cultural and technical factors condition access and use of online spaces, the concept of harm. So what kind of experiences, harmful experiences minorities have, and aiming for a right, the safety to exist and act online. The intersectional approaches. I know this is there is pushback at the moment, but I hope that era will come to an end soon. And then the cultural representation agenda, which is obviously context specific. All in all, my message from the best practices perspective is that there is space and opportunity for identity formation through the diffusion, and access to mainstream online spaces, including for minority groups. So obviously we need a lot more work, but it doesn't look so gloomy at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Agata?
First of all, I would like to say that the integration preservation paradox is one of the most important challenges facing contemporary Europe, and we can see this very clearly on the example of France and its impact of the social and political situation. And the museums are particularly interesting in this context because, as I already said, they have traditionally been institutions closely linked to the construction of the national building of national identity. And for much of modern history, museums help define who belong to the nation and who construct the national story. As a result, minorities were often represented only insofar as they could be incorporated into broader national narratives. But today, museums face a different challenge. They are increasingly expected to acknowledge and present diversity and to represent the experience of groups that were previously excluded from these dominant narratives. And the preservation of minorities may preserve certain aspects of heritage, but they do not necessarily capture the very complex and diversity of the situation. And for this reason, I would argue that authentic cultural continuity cannot be achieved solely through institution museum practices, because cultural identity is not an object that could be easily displayed. And I think that to conclude, the role of the museum should be therefore be less about defining narratives, defining minorities' identities, and more about creation of spaces where different perspectives can be negotiated and discourse and then be presented. And rather than offering a single authoritative narrative, they should facilitate the dialogue. And I promise some examples, some good examples. And when I was thinking about this, the best practices and was researching them, I think that the most common example from the museum perspective is the Polish Museum, the Polish Jewish Museum in Warsaw. And I have to agree that this is a very good practice. But when I was here, I was thinking about also the museum in Latte is in Czech Republic. And this is a museum of Roma Holocaust in Czech Republic, and I kindly invite you to read the article of this place written by Martyna Wasiuta. It's online at the Institute of Central Europe page, and she explained step by step why this is a very good museum. But to give also another example, I was thinking about some common subject about the small museums. Very often they are placed in the next to the frontier in this region in between in the past. And I was thinking about the exhibition in Jasło Museum. It's a really small museum in Poland. Because very often the small museum, far from this political center, they can present exactly this shared, negotiated narrative of the past involving the minorities. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to pick up from that idea of a space for dialogue that also happens through the media. I guess one of the challenges there is to avoid that binary of identity and that an us versus them that appears constantly, and that as usually linguistic minorities or any other minority groups feel the need to put themselves always in contrast with the majority. And I will give you a double example that shows the positive and the negative. And I will mention the case of Radio Falche in Northern Ireland, in Belfast. And that was a community radio station. It was developed out of an interest of the community to keep the Irish language alive in an area that it was very negatively perceived, at least by some part of the population. However, throughout the years, Radio Falche has continued to do their work and related constantly to the community, to the point that now in Northern Ireland, in the latest surveys done, people are willing, regardless of their political views, to embrace Irish. So it shows that if there's a certain community interest, and media can help in that case. However, at the same time, and I don't know if you've seen the news recently of what happened in Belfast, there's also a reaction against another them. So in this case, other types of migration. So you see, at the same time, you're experiencing that there's more willingness to embrace Irish, which is a minority language in Northern Ireland, yet at the same time, then there's a rejection of other identity groups. So that's why that tyranny of the separation of the binary of identity is something that needs to be attacked. Another great example recently is the case of Laïsta, which is kind of a ranking that was developed in Catalonia by the civil sector that is ranking which are the most important influencers in Catalan. And there's a reason for that. You need to encourage them to keep on using Catalan because since they're bilingual, they could easily shift to Spanish and have a larger market, a larger pool of people that they could reach. So the idea of Laïsta was to encourage people to use Catalan and to recognize the positive impact that these influencers have on the use of the language. So that is now being taken as a good example, and we in Pluralink Media are trying to continue to foster that idea into other language situations, because it definitely shows that it's better to go for the encouragement side rather than always punishing and saying, yeah, you know, it's bad if you shift languages, because you might have reasons for it. KYriaki just mentioned that people might have a conscious decision to shift the language to reach other audiences because they might want to reach other audiences for specific reasons. But if you encourage them to use their own language, they usually are happy to do it. So the more we can encourage this type of processes, the better it would be to avoid that necessary debate on whether you have to pick an identity and pick a language necessarily, and then you use it. You use it just for the purposes that you consider are relevant to you and to your own community.
Thank you. And Tieni?
Thank you. I will not repeat the good points that have already been put forward. In the morning session, the opening session, there was this very good comment about identities not being competitive. They don't compete. You can have a minority identity and still be a full worthy member of a nation. I think that's important to remember, and considering the demographic situation in many countries, we need all the people we can get. So I think that it would be wise for nations to think about how to include and integrate in a positive sense all different types of minorities that they can. And in order to do that, you need to include them in the democratic debate. And for people to be able to take part in the democratic debate, they need information and a platform for debate. So in the minority languages, we have the minority language media, but when thinking about majority languages in different states, they also have a responsibility. And one example or best practice that one can think about, especially when thinking about new members of society, is easy language news. When you make news in a easier language for example, accessibility reasons. But these are also very good for language learning. So that is one example I could mention here. And also, I think it's important to realize that there are not contradictions between, you know, being part of a state and belonging to a specific group, because we all belong to specific groups, as have been mentioned here before. So one other best practice or idea that I could put forward, as you asked us to find some. In Finland, we have the other national language as a subject in school. So if you go to a Swedish school, you have to learn Finnish, and if you go to a Finnish school, you have to learn Swedish. One way, because well, we start learning Finnish much earlier in the Swedish schools, and they start later in the Finnish schools, and the attitudes are not always so positive towards the minority language Swedish. So one way to try to increase the interest for the Swedish language is a project with language ambassadors, who are often people from culture or people you might know. They might be, you know, musicians, celebrities in some way, or other known people who have learned from the majority group, mind you. Okay, it's raining again. From the majority group who have learned the minority language. So they go to these schools and talk about their language learning process and all the good things that have come with that, the use they have, the asset they have in the minority language. So I think you mentioned that as well. I think we need to try to make a positive discussion about minority groups and also include them in all ways in society. And of course, you know, public communication is an important part of that. And I was thinking actually about the alert that came here in the morning. I think it was only in Lithuanian. So, I mean, that's also a thing to think about. How does society communicate with different groups in different languages? We get enlightenment at the end of the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for my distinguished speakers. And now we have a good time for discussion, so we may move to Q&A questions. Q&A session, not questions. I didn't see who was the first.
Thank you very much. I've learned so much, and I also could somehow structurize my thoughts thanks to your presentations. I have a comment, maybe a question comment to Agata, because I've been interested for a very long time in how language and languages are displayed in museums. But of course, because of my interest in minorities, I'm more and more interested in how minority narratives might be presented, not only in those national or mainstream museums. And here I would like to reward the quote by Jacek Kuroń: please don't burn the party committees, try to found your own ones. So it's going on also in Poland. So especially I'm interested in those small local museums that appear and try to somehow fill in a gap, which sometimes is important for the majority narration, but very much important for the minority themselves, especially those who have no kin state, so who cannot attach themselves to the narrative somewhere, which becomes also a majority-dominated narrative only from abroad. So, well, you mentioned Pauline, you mentioned sorry, I don't know this, but there's a very interesting, small one room, but extremely interesting museum of history of Kashubian culture in Wejherowo. It's one room where you have very interesting experiments. So the main facts, developments in the history of the contemporary Kashubian culture is shown from two sides, and you can change it. Polish perspective, so majority perspective, and now local, our Kashubian perspective. Wilamowice, which I mentioned in my presentation, enjoys a wonderful, thanks to the Norwegian funds, a wonderful museum of the local culture, which has become not only a place where they can finally present their narrative about their, because of the size, micro history, but it's a big history, but only of a small group, which is also now playing a role of the so-called safe space for the language. It's becoming bilingual. The new director of the Silesian Museum in Katowice has just now decided that his plan is to make the Silesian Museum fully bilingual plus English, Polish, Silesian, and English. Latgalians in East Latvia have a very small museum which tells the story of the Latgalian language from the Latgalian perspective. Of course, also in Western Europe, like I visited a very interesting museum of Jersey culture on Channel Islands, or the wonderful, very small 2 chambers, 1 house museum of the monks' language, with 1 chamber like the history of monks, and the other one, the present and future of monks. So, what do you think about creating, or at least fostering, new micro narratives, minority narratives through the way of museum? And I have also like a side question to you as researcher, both of you as researchers on media, and especially, do you think such stationary museum may play any role in the future, especially from the perspective of young audience? Thank you.
My answer would be very short. First of all, thank you very much for your comment. It's very informative, and yeah, I think it's a very important question, very important comment, and very important observation. I'm a big believer in the small, much more specialized museum, because they, first of all, they facilitate the creation of maybe not such political narratives, but they are much more close to show the diversity of the problem that they are presenting for. And the second point that I would like to make, that they are far from the political center, and the politics of memory does not have the impact of them. And what we can observe and what we can learn from these big narrative museums, that they always create some discussion, some critique, which is the very strong one. So yeah, I totally agree with you 100%.
On the point that you made, there's another interesting case that is worth highlighting at the KYriaki, so at the Welsh National Library. There was an exhibition on the broadcasting history of Wales, and it's a bilingual broadcasting history, because it has the content that has been made in Welsh and the content that has been made in English. And it was a very interesting exhibition in which you could pick up the headphones and then you could switch languages, and then you could move into, as you were moving through the museum, you were listening to different bits and bobs and in the different languages. And it was planned as an exhibition that could travel out of Wales, because as I mentioned earlier, this is this concept that the Welsh language belongs to the whole of Wales, even if people don't speak the language, even if only a minority of the population speak the language. So it was important in the design of that exhibition that that exhibition could travel to different places as well, to be enjoyed and for that to be part of their legacy. So I think that is a good and interesting example that could be mentioned.
Well, I'm certainly no expert on museums, and you probably have more to say about how to reach young people, but I can just give an example from, I mean, I think physical museums will always play a part, but an example from Sweden, where they have this, I don't know what it's called in English, it's Livrustkammaren. It's about like the royal history and just artifacts from the royal history. It's a physical museum, but they have a super good online content where they do posts on social media regularly, very humorous types of social media posts where they like show a helmet and they're like, you need the helmet today, you know you do. So that's a way to, I think, reach maybe young people in a way that might work, but I mean, no expert on this.
And Carol?
Thank you. Thank you for your speeches, all of you. That was very interesting to hear your perspective. I have two questions and maybe one comment. One comment is that about the Roma community, we don't see the perspective at all museums that are existing in the world, the perspective of our history. Like we saw the historical facts, for example, Samurdari Pen Roma genocide. Because we see that a little bit different, like the other nations. That is too easy to say that only the Germans were the murderers about the Roma community. That's too easy. That's the only one evils. You know, that's too easy. And I see that the conflict of interest, how to see a historical truth when I was involved in the bad side of the story. We Roma, historical was only victims. That's the comment, the question to the media. Is this even impossible to change the narration, for example, about the generally minorities, because always we see the information about the stereotype that is, and that is right now very growing. Some political actors built on the information, on the disinformation, what happened. Right now we see that in Ireland, in France, in Poland, in each of country, I think. And it's possible to change the narration and share the true perspective about each of the communities that we have in our countries. And if that is the interest of the host population, because sometimes I think that it's not the interest. What do you think about it?
Well, I'm going to bring you another best practice that I think you might enjoy, and this is a case from Colombian television. The Colombian television public system created in 2010 a TV show called La Lleva. La Lleva is the game of tag, but it's done by kids who are transported with a member of their family to another part of the country and another part of the culture. One of the things that I found fascinating from that was that two indigenous groups were part of this. So a citizen of Colombia from another part would travel to an indigenous community, live with them, and the other kid explains all the elements of culture. And one was from the Roma community in Bogota. So it was very interesting because that was the first time that I had seen the Roma community being portrayed on Colombian television, even though since 2010 the Romani language is also part of the native languages of Colombia, which is how they are defined. So it was very interesting because this was a moment in which all these kids from different parts of the country were being taken elsewhere, and they were presented with the culture by another kid. And this was a very successful TV show in the public Colombian television service. And it was one that really showed that you could be part of this nation, and all of these kids were, amazed about what happened in the other corners of the country. Different ethnicities, different color of skin, different food that they would try, and they were all learning as the audience was learning. And that was a really good example just showing there was nothing about, stereotypes, because they were explained by the same culture, by the same members of the culture, and why that was relevant or important to them.
Are there any questions? One, okay, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Ruslanas Iržikevičius. I'm director of a Lithuanian Media Support Fund. We're also covering national minorities in one of our programs. And I would like to ask the question, especially to our guest from Finland. I'm fascinated to hear, I knew about it, but I would like to know more about it. That is Swedish-speaking media in Finland, that it is rather small minority, 5%, but you mentioned you have 7 or 8 newspapers, dailies running. I remember about 7 or 8 years ago when Lithuanian national radio used to have European media coverage or briefing on interesting topics. Quite often we also used to get Finnish media, that is Swedish-speaking newspapers also covering interesting stories, but on international basis and sort of interesting topics. So it's really fascinating that such a small minority is managing to run such a big and powerful media outlets. How is this possible? What is the secret of it? Thank you.
Okay. I will answer very shortly, and then we can probably discuss afterwards more. Well, one answer is that Swedish is a national language, so it's in the legislation that there's a YLE law saying that YLE, the National Public Service Broadcasting Company, has to provide for both language groups on equal terms. So this equal terms has been interpreted quite favorably for the Swedish language population so far. So that is the public service content. Then thinking about the newspapers, we have fortunately some foundations who have been so successful in placing their stocks ages ago and with donations. So we have had a very strong foundation-based ownership for the newspapers. This changed now, actually, a couple of years ago when the biggest Nordic media conglomerate, Bonnier News, bought most of the Finland Swedish newspapers, which is interesting because you usually say that minority language media can never be commercially viable. So, but they bought them because they are commercial. They had a commercial interest in them. So we'll see how that develops. I mean, now they feel really empowered because they have this big owner, journalistic owner. But of course, they will need to make a profit in another way than they had to do with the foundations as owners. So short answer, I don't know if I really was able to answer their questions, but we can discuss more in detail after this. Thank you.
Thank you very much once more. Unfortunately, we have to move to an end, but I think that we will do that inspired and motivated to make further researches, to continue dialogue and cooperation in the field of minority protection across Europe.
We move towards our last talks. Closing remarks, and if now I can invite Mr. Andrzej Dudziński and Ewelina Dobrowolska.
Distinguished guests, distinguished partners of our conference, today let's reverse the good habit that ladies first should start, and we agreed with Minister Ewelina that I will try to conclude from our perspective. As was mentioned, I serve in the Polish embassy in Lithuania for over 5 years. Let me start with really huge appreciation and many thanks to our co-organizers from the Institute of Central Europe and Mykola Romero University. It was a huge privilege to work with you on the conference, and I missed some part of the conference because our Secretary General of the Ministry, our Chief of Service, had some political meetings, including Minister of Justice, also very much concentrated on minority issues. So a part I missed, but the part I was able to follow, and my colleagues from the embassy followed everything, proved that the topic is of huge importance, that it was a very good and timely moment for initiating this discussion on the best practices on national minorities. So many thanks to all the panelists, to moderators for really doing a great job. And for me personally, it's a great honor. Then back 24 years ago, I was Erasmus student at this place. It was not called Mykola Romero University. It was Lietuvos Teisės Universitetas, so Lithuanian Law University. And I would never think at the time that I will get back here after many years and conclude a discussion on national minorities. One last sentence on my personal dedication to the topic. I have 2 unwritten PhD on national minorities that I started somehow due to many reasons, did not finish. But the first one was under the topic lessons learned by the international community from the genocide in Rwanda, 1994, which is outside of Europe, of course, but it's also about national minorities and ethnicity being the ground for the atrocities that happened there over 30 years ago. And the second one is maybe more actual. It was supposed to be on the implementation of Polish-German Treaty on Good Neighborhood Relations from 1991. We will have the exact 35th anniversary of this treaty in a few days, on 17th of June. And as it comes to the implementation, it would be really interesting to see from both sides of the border how it works and where it still does not work. Maybe I'll get back to at least this one day. Also important minorities studies. As it was mentioned here, there are very different approaches to the national minorities in each and every country. We did not cover today, I guess, the example of Switzerland, which is obviously composed of a few difficult to say minorities, but at least ethnic groups, language groups, and it looks like the federal state of Swiss works quite good since many centuries, and not having huge discussions about how to which language should prevail and which not, and even the national football coach needs to speak at least 3 languages in order to be nominated. I guess they had the World Cup starting today, so maybe we will hear it, the dialogues in the television. We have the a very good example of Slovenia, where very small national minorities rounding not even 1% have the permanent seat in the parliament, Italians and the Hungarians. We saw also in the Balkans. We saw as the reason for outbreak of the Second World War how the national minorities might be misused for political purposes, and what happens if it's the case. I look at Monika Haber as one of the best experiences I made here in Vilnius was the exhibition. We were partner, but it was actually mainly dealt with and brought to Vilnius by European Network of Remembrance and Solidarity on the different memories of the First World War and the mid-war period, from the Romanian perspective, from Polish perspective, Lithuanian, Hungarian, and so on. So we see also how important the dialogue remains in this field, and it quite often also touches upon national minorities. So as we saw today, the topic is still valid, still important. We have one framework convention and we have one charter of language charter by the Council of Europe, but we have many roads that lead to the implementation. We are not of our all of European countries are moving the same path or the same speed in the implementation, but we really make progress in this field, and it should be acknowledged. We may learn from each other, and as it was mentioned in the speech of our guest from Poland, Minister Mościcka-Dendys, I would consider the Polish example as a really good one, and we are ready to share it with those who would be interested. Of course, as the borders changed after the Second World War, without us being asked whether we want to change it or not, the very multi-ethnic society or population of Poland got rather homogeneous, but we still have some 3% of national minorities or ethnic minorities in Poland. We see how good the topographic science work in Poland, in the areas where the German minority or the Lithuanian minority lives, and I guess it's something that should be noticed. We have the same in Adiga and Südtirol. We have the same with Aland Islands and Swedish-Finnish. We have it in Schleswig-Holstein on both sides of the border. So it's really something that helps to keep this culture, maybe not cultural heritage, but the history and the importance of this presence of the national minority language in the public sphere. So last words, really. I know I'm talking very much too long. Resilience. We may build resilience, including national minorities, in those tough geopolitical times. We saw the bad weather might come, hopefully not, and the sunshine will be back. But the geopolitical times are really tense and tough. So it's important that the national minorities feel really well integrated and happy simply in their national states, to build stronger resilience, to fight disinformation also among them. Then once we are stronger, or as we used to say in NATO, stronger together, we may face every challenge and do not really care about possible hostile actions from outsiders. So I'm pretty sure that our today conference contributed to the discussion, to learn from each other, to share the best practices. I guess we will continue during the lunch. And once again, many thanks for those who found the time to be here with us. Thank you very much. Ačiū labai.
First of all, thank you very much, especially for organizers, for opportunity to be here, to be a part of this amazing discussion. Thank you very much for panelists sharing your best practice insights. I have worked on national minority rights for almost a decade from very different perspective, from NGO perspective, as well as serving Minister of Justice. So this topic is very personal, but as well as professional one. And today we had very rich discussion, but the first session, I'm sorry, it was the favorite one for me, because the management of diversity when facing the war next to your border was especially interesting. It was a small question in the first session, and I will try to go to this topic in the second half of my speech. I do believe we should speak about this because it's very important when we speak how to move forward with protection of national minorities. I was asked by organizers to share a few short observations from my perspective, especially about those legal changes which happened in Lithuania recent years. So as Dainius Babilas, the director of National Minority Department Lithuania, has mentioned, Lithuania didn't have national minority law for almost 15 years, so until 2024. So the natural question is, why did it take so long to adopt the law? And how was it finally achieved in such a difficult political circumstances? In my view, one of the main reasons was the long legal vacuum. For 15 years, the issue of national minorities became politically sensitive. It was used again and again during election by different political parties. Some supported broader protection for the minorities. Others claimed that minority rights could create risk for the state. This allowed both sides to mobilize their voters, but it didn't help to solve the issue. In 2024, the adoption of the law of national minorities became possible because of several strategic choices. First, we framed the issue as a question of a state responsibility for the rights of its own citizens. It was important to end manipulative political narratives that linked the law mainly to the relation with other countries. The message had to be clear. This law is about Lithuania and its citizens. This narrative was especially important because Lithuania was facing several major challenges at the same time. Lukashenko regime was using migration as hybrid attack and pushing thousands of migrants across the border into Lithuania. Lithuania was also receiving an unprecedented number of refugees from Ukraine. At the same time, our country provided the safe place for members of Belarusian opposition. This was the right moment to clearly separate migration policy from national minority policy. These groups face different challenges and need different forms of state support. Migrants often need help to learn the state language, enter the labor market, to find housing. National minorities in Lithuania face different tasks. They are Lithuanian citizens. They speak Lithuanian, they work, they are part of our society. At the same time, they want to preserve their culture, identity, tradition, to have access to quality education. Second, Russia's brutal aggression against Ukraine made us rethink the role of a foreign influence in the question related to national minorities. Different approaches were discussed. from limiting the use of native languages to strengthening their protection while also taking into account national and security interests. And Lithuania chose the path of protection and balance. This direction is totally different than Latvia and Estonia chose meanwhile. Lithuania adopted the law on national minorities and law on the original name spelling. We restricted media funding to provide dedicated support for minority language media and to help counter propaganda from aggressor states. We also secured guarantees for national minorities to access education in their mother tongue. At the same time, Lithuania encouraged schools to choose European Union languages instead of Russian or as foreign languages, but without banning this Russian language. I believe this helped to avoid deeper division in society during a very difficult period. Lithuania is also, I do believe, one of a few, or maybe even the only one country that translated all OSCE recommendations and guidelines regarding national minorities into Lithuanian from their own state budget, and just because they decided to do that. I strongly believe that these developments are important. They help protect and empower all citizens with equality and respect. Of course, every law can be improved. We already heard during the first session the ambition of this Minister of Justice to go with the amendments. I wish them the best. There is always the room to do it better. And the second part of my speech may be controversial, so please take it as my personal opinion. It's not the representation of official position of the organizers. In the last session, experts shared different best practices from different countries, but you cannot simply copy and transfer all the solution you like, especially if you speak about legislation. Regarding media, I guess there are best practices in Sweden we can think about. I do believe that in today's geopolitical situation, context is crucial. Laws are adopted by politicians, so political and geopolitical context is an essential aspect to address. And this is something that is often missing in discussion about national minorities' rights, especially language rights in public spaces and public life. The rule-based international order is being challenged. The independence of democratic states are being questioned. Borders and airspace are being violated by aggressors. In this context, we must continue to speak about national minorities and look for the best ways to protect and support them, regardless of their language. But we also should not be afraid to say that many of us understand, but no one is ready to say publicly. No country that lives next to the open aggression and mass killing of civilians can ignore security concerns when discussing language policy. No country that remembers the crimes of Soviet and Russian regime from Katynia to Bucha can treat this question as purely technical. The Russian language should not be banned, but we must be very honest. This language is also used by Russian state as political weapon. It is used in propaganda machine. It is used to build influence, and it's used to justify aggression, as we saw in Ukraine. Let me give you a very concrete example. If we discuss whether Lithuania or any other Baltic state should expand the rules on bilingual street signs, we must also say clearly that this could mean in practice. In some municipalities in Lithuania, it could mean Russian language street names. In normal times, this might be a regular discussion about language rights, but these are not normal times. Russia is waging a brutal war against Ukraine, and many people in Lithuania know Russian not because it's their mother tongue. They know it just because Lithuania was occupied by the Soviet regime. This history also matters. So let us ask you the question directly. Should or even can Lithuania in this context create new legal possibilities for Russian language street names? And my answer is very clear, no. And this is not about hostility towards Russian-speaking people. It is not about banning the Russian language. And it doesn't mean I support decisions taken in Latvia or Estonia. during that time, opposite Lithuania made a decision to guarantee national minorities' rights. It's about understanding the reality. It is also about recognizing the theory must meet the situation on the ground and not to ignore that. If that does not happen, then instead of having democratic discussion about national minority rights, as we have today, we risk turning into the issue into security debate. And the outcomes may be the opposite of what was it intended. So this could make it easier to discuss the future of national minority rights in an honest way, without avoiding the difficult questions and without ignoring the elephant in the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone who participated, who stayed until the very end of the conference. Thank you once again for the co-organizers, for the Embassy of the Polish Republic, and for Aleksandra Kuczyńska-Zonik, who was really working hard to have this conference in place.